I've always liked camping alone, not just away from people, but really out there. I'm not talking about campgrounds with fire pits and RV hookups. I'm talking about the deep stuff, 30, 40 miles into national forest land, where if something goes wrong, you're really on your own. Maybe that's what drew me to it in the first place. The quiet, the space, the risk. It was a break from everything. That trip was in early fall, probably late September. It was the time of year when the air is dry and the nights drop hard, especially in the mountains. I had packed everything I needed in the truck: tent, food, gear, my old aluminum cooler. I had my dog with me, too. Her name's Roxy, a 4-year-old mutt, lean and strong. She looks like part shepherd, part lab, but who knows? She's always been good outdoors. Listens well, stays close, doesn't panic. We left around noon that Friday, drove about 3 hours north into a patch of forest I'd scouted on satellite maps a couple weeks before. No trails, no people. It looked promising. The drive was smooth until the last hour or so, which turned into a mess of switchbacks and narrow dirt roads barely wide enough for the truck. I was watching the gas needle slowly inch down, knowing I'd have to be careful about the drive back. We got to the spot around 4:30 p.m. It was a small clearing off a side trail, totally overgrown. I had to drive through knee-high grass to get there, but once I did, it was perfect. A thin line of trees bordered the clearing on 3 sides, and a gentle slope led down to a creek I could hear but not yet see. Everything smelled like pine, bark, and that faint trace of cold on the air that tells you the season's changed. I cut the engine and opened the door. Roxy jumped out and started sniffing around right away. I set up camp, pitched the tent, laid out the folding chair, got the fire pit set up with stones and dry wood I'd brought. The sun was still up, but it was starting to dip low enough that the shadows were stretching long and the color of the sky was turning orange around the edges. I lit the fire just as the light started to fade. Dinner was simple: beans, bread, and a couple beers. I sat by the fire, listening to the sound of the creek in the distance, and watched Roxy lie down beside me. She stretched out, front legs extended, her ears flicking now and then as she caught noises I couldn't hear. I leaned back in the chair, cracked another beer, and just stared into the fire. It was the kind of silence you don't get back in town. No engines, no music, just the wind passing through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch in the forest. Sometimes, I'd close my eyes and pretend I could hear the earth moving underneath it all. Maybe an hour passed like that. The fire was burning clean, and the stars were coming out. I had one of those cheap flashlights with a rubber grip beside me, but I hadn't turned it on. I didn't need it yet. I wasn't planning to stay up long, just until the fire burned down low enough. I figured I'd sleep light anyway, like I usually did on solo trips. Roxy had been quiet most of the night, just shifting positions now and then, but out of nowhere she stood up, stiff, like something had triggered her hard. No sound from her, just that rigid stance with her neck craned forward. Her ears were up, her eyes locked on the tree line across the clearing. I watched her for a few seconds before I looked in the same direction. I didn't see anything at first. Then she started growling, low, deep, not frantic, not barking, just that controlled, dangerous growl that meant she wasn't confused or curious. She was warning something. I stood up slowly and grabbed the flashlight. My other hand went to my belt where I kept a fixed blade. I didn't pull it out, but I felt better knowing it was there. I scanned the tree line with the light, starting left to right in a slow arc. Nothing. Then I moved back again, slower this time. That's when I saw it. 2 eyes, reflecting the beam from the flashlight. Low to the ground, about 100 yards out. Just staring back. No movement, no sound. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. I've seen deer, elk, coyotes, all kinds of animals out there at night. These eyes were different. They were close together, set forward, not on the sides like prey animals. And the height was all wrong for something like a deer. These were predator eyes. I kept the light on it. I could make out the faint shape of its head and shoulders in the beam. Low and muscular. And then I saw it shift its weight, step once to the side. That's when it clicked. Mountain lion. It was watching us. I didn't move the light off it. I stayed where I was, I didn't want to panic Roxy or myself. Mountain lions are ambush predators. They don't usually stare you down. They stalk, they wait, and they strike when you're not looking. This one being visible at all was strange. I think it knew I saw it, but it didn't run. That part stuck with me. After maybe a full minute of the stare down, it turned and slipped back into the woods. Just gone. No sound again. Like a ghost through the trees. I waited. Nothing came back. Roxy was still growling quietly, but now she was pacing a little. I let the flashlight hang at my side and looked around the edges of the clearing every few seconds. That thing had been there for who knows how long. Watching. Waiting. Eventually, I walked back to the fire and sat again, but I didn't touch the beer. I sat upright, flashlight in my lap, knife drawn now and resting across my leg. Roxy lay beside me again, but she didn't relax. She stayed ready, eyes wide, head up. I didn't sleep that night, not even a little. The fire burned low, and I kept feeding it with the last of the wood. I wasn't about to turn in while that thing was still nearby. I knew enough to understand that they're not out for humans unless they're starving or sick. But it wasn't me it had been watching. It was Roxy. That part hit me in waves, hours later, after I packed up and drove out the next morning. Mountain lions don't usually bother with anything bigger than them unless they're desperate. I'm 6 foot, 200 pounds. I wasn't what it was interested in. Roxy, though, she was just the right size. Not a pup, not a full-grown wolf either. Something that looked like it might be worth the risk. I kept thinking back to the way she growled before I saw anything. She must have known way before I did that something wasn't right. Her senses picked it up, the smell, the posture, something. I don't think that was the first time she'd felt something off in the woods. What got to me was wondering how many other times we'd camped out in the middle of nowhere and something had been watching from the trees. Maybe it was the first time I caught it, but maybe it wasn't the first time it had happened. That's the thing about wilderness. You don't always see what's watching you. Most of the time, you don't know it's there at all. I drove straight home after packing up that morning. Didn't even make coffee. Just threw everything back in the truck while the sun was barely breaking through the trees. Roxy stayed close the whole time. Her tail was low, and her ears were still on high alert. That wasn't like her. She didn't go sniffing around. She didn't wander. She just followed me, silent and careful. When we got back, I unloaded everything and checked her over. She was fine. No scratches, no injuries, but she stayed uneasy for days. Wouldn't sleep unless I was in the room. She'd lie by the door and watch the hallway like we were still out there. That trip changed how I see the woods. I still go camping, still hike, still fish, still get off the beaten path. But now I pay more attention, not just to what I can see, but to what she sees. If her ears go up, I listen. If she growls, I don't question it. And every time we're out there now, I catch myself looking past the firelight just a little longer, trying to see if there's something watching, trying to catch the glint of eyes in the dark. Because I know now that sometimes they're there, and they're not looking at you. They're looking at who's with you. And sometimes they're close enough that you can hear them breathe. You just don't realize it until they want you to. I've always loved being out in the woods. There's something about it that calms me, especially after a long week. The noise of everyday life drops away, replaced by the wind in the trees, the rustle of squirrels, or the occasional snap of a twig somewhere out of sight. I grew up around stories of the woods, some good, some bad, but they never stopped me from heading out there when I could. Last fall, I took a solo trip into the Appalachians. I wanted to get deep into the forest, away from campsites and other hikers, away from phones and engines and anything with a screen. It was October, so the trees were all fire orange and deep red. I picked a spot miles off the main trail, a place I'd scoped out the year before while hiking with friends. Back then, it had looked like a good area. Flat enough for a tent, some natural cover, and a small stream nearby for water. It wasn't marked on any maps as a proper site, which made it perfect in my eyes. I parked my truck on a rough turnout along a narrow gravel road and hiked in with everything I'd need. Tent, food, water filter, small hatchet, basic survival gear. I brought a radio too, one of those small, hand-cranked ones just in case. and a flare gun for emergencies. I had no cell service once I passed the first ridge, but that was expected. By the time I set up camp, the sun was low and the temperature had dropped. The shadows stretched long between the trees. I gathered wood, built a small fire, and ate a simple dinner of dried sausage and rice. Then I sat by the flames until the sky went black. That first night was peaceful. There were a few sounds off in the dark, things moving through the brush, but that's normal out there. Most animals keep their distance if you're noisy enough. I slept fine, rolled up tight in my sleeping bag with the tent zipped up tight. The second day, I explored further out. I followed the stream north for a couple miles, crossed a narrow footpath that wasn't on my map, and saw what looked like remnants of old logging activity. Half-buried metal parts, rotting planks, the skeleton of a small bridge. Nothing too surprising for the area. The woods here have been used for everything from mining to moonshine at one time or another. That afternoon, I came across something that gave me pause. I was about 3 miles from my tent, moving through a thicker patch of forest, when I noticed a sharp smell. It wasn't a dead animal or anything natural, it was sharp, chemical. I stopped and looked around. About 50 feet uphill behind a thicket was a shack. At least it looked like a shack. Rough-hewn boards, a sagging roof, half covered in vines. It didn't look lived in, but it wasn't falling apart either. I stood there for a long time, debating whether to check it out. The smell was stronger near it, sweet and sour, almost like fermented fruit but with a sting. It reminded me of stories my dad used to tell me. Back in the 50s, he worked with the Soil Conservation Corps, and he said once he came across a moonshine still way out in the woods. Said it was the scariest moment of his life because moonshiners didn't take kindly to being found, especially not by government workers. He left fast and didn't look back. I figured this place might have been one of those old still sites. It looked abandoned, but that smell made me wonder. I didn't go closer. I turned around and walked back the way I came, careful not to snap too many branches or leave an obvious trail, just in case. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that shack, wondering if someone was out there still using it. I hadn't seen any footprints or signs of recent use, but I hadn't exactly searched either. I left my fire burning longer than usual, hoping the light might discourage anyone from coming near. Around midnight, I heard something in the woods. It wasn't a bear or a deer. This was slower, more deliberate. A two-legged walk. A step, pause, step, pause, circling wide around my camp. I sat up, heart pounding, and reached for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away where I was in the tent. The steps moved off after a while, maybe 15 minutes, then silence. I waited another hour before I fell asleep again, the hatchet gripped in my hand. The next morning, I walked the perimeter of my camp. I didn't see anything at first, but about 40 yards off to the south, I found a boot print. It was fresh, dirt still moist and the edges crisp. Definitely not mine. It looked like a worn work boot. I didn't like it. I decided not to stay a third night. I packed up slow, keeping an ear out, and made the decision to head back toward the truck by a different route, one that swung around the shack entirely. I didn't want to risk passing by it again, even if it meant a longer hike. I checked my compass, confirmed my direction, and set off, keeping my pace steady but alert. For the first couple of hours, everything was fine. The forest was quiet. I passed through patches of pine and hardwood, crossed another old logging road, and figured I was about halfway back when I heard something ahead. It was a low metallic clank. Then a voice, not words, but a low murmur. I froze. I dropped low behind a stump and stayed still. After a moment, I peeked over the top. Down in a shallow dip, maybe 30 yards away, were two men. They looked rough, beards, worn clothes, one of them wearing a wide-brim hat. They were working on a rusted metal barrel over a fire. I couldn't see it all, but it looked like a homemade still. So it wasn't abandoned after all. This wasn't history, it was happening now. One of them stepped away from the setup and looked around. He wasn't looking at me specifically, but I ducked back behind the stump anyway. I stayed there for almost 30 minutes, barely breathing. When I finally moved again, I took a long detour around them, moving uphill and sticking to the ridgeline where I had better sightlines. Every snap of a branch under my boots made me wince. Every time a bird took off, I flinched. I made it back to the road just before dusk. The truck was still there, untouched. I loaded my gear fast and drove out without even changing out of my boots. I didn't tell anyone right away. It felt like one of those stories no one really believes unless they've been out there. But I couldn't get it out of my head. The boot print, the sound of someone walking around my camp, the still in the woods, the two men. It all lined up too well. If I hadn't changed my route, or if I'd gotten curious and gone closer to that shack, I don't know what they would have done if they'd caught me watching. I don't want to find out. Now when I go camping, I stay closer to established trails. I don't wander off too far, and I always make sure someone knows where I'm going. The woods can feel peaceful, even magical sometimes, but they're still used by people, and not everyone out there wants to be found. I think about my dad's story sometimes now. He got out fast when he saw a still just like I did. I used to think it was just an old man's exaggeration, but now I know better. Some things aren't stories. Some things are warnings. We were about a 5-hour drive from home, up in the mountains near a small, heavily wooded state forest. I'd been there before a few times growing up, always with my dad and uncles. This trip was a little different. I was the one in charge this time. We had the whole family with us. My wife, my 2 kids, and our dog, an older yellow lab named Scout who, despite slowing down the past couple years, still loved being outside more than anything. It was early fall, the weather crisp but not too cold yet, and the days were still warm enough to hike in a t-shirt. Nights dipped into the 40s, which I didn't mind at all. We picked a secluded campsite maybe half a mile from where you parked. One of those semi-primitive spots where there's no bathroom, no cell service, and the only real marker is a post with a faded number on it. There was a small clearing tucked into a bend in the trees, and just past that, maybe a 2-minute walk, there was a stream with water clear enough to drink straight from it. We had a couple of hammocks, 2 tents, and a collapsible table. It was quiet and peaceful, the kind of place where the only sounds at night are wind moving through the trees and the occasional owl calling in the dark. The first night was uneventful. We set up camp in the late afternoon, got a small fire going, grilled some hot dogs on sticks, and let the kids roast marshmallows. Everyone was in a good mood, and for once, nobody was distracted by a phone or tablet. It's always strange how quickly you settle into the rhythm of camping. How normal it starts to feel when you're away from traffic and noise and notifications. The kids went to bed around 9, bundled up in their sleeping bags with our dog curled at their feet. My wife turned in about a half hour later, and I stayed up a while longer, sitting by the fire with a cold beer in my hand and Scout at my side. There was nothing unusual about that moment. I remember it being quiet, almost too quiet, and very still. The fire had burned down to glowing red coals, and the light was soft and warm. I could see just enough to make out the trees at the edge of camp, maybe 20 or 30 feet out. Beyond that was just black. Scout lay next to my chair, head resting on his paws, and I could hear his breathing over the crackling of the fire. I sipped my beer and leaned back. I wasn't thinking about anything in particular, just enjoying the calm. Then Scout lifted his head and gave a low growl. It wasn't loud, not at first, just a quiet rumble in his chest. His ears were perked, and he stared off into the trees like something was there. I looked the same way, squinting into the dark, but I didn't see anything. I put my beer down and whispered something like, "Easy," though I don't know why, maybe just a reflex, but he didn't relax. The growl got louder, and now he was on his feet, muscles tense, tail rigid. His nose lifted as he sniffed the air, and I saw the fur on the back of his neck stand up. That's when I started to feel it. Something wasn't right. I stood up and walked over to the edge of the firelight, maybe 15 feet from the ring of stones. The woods beyond that line looked like a solid wall. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small flashlight. It wasn't one of those huge tactical lights, just a simple aluminum one, about the size of a beer can. I clicked it on and swept it slowly across the trees. At first, I didn't see anything. The beam cut through the dark in a narrow cone, catching small reflections, Spider eyes, maybe, or bits of dew on leaves, but nothing that looked alive. Scout was standing beside me, still growling, his focus locked in one direction. Then I saw it. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. Two pale, round spots caught the beam. Eyes, definitely eyes, but they didn't move. They just hovered there about 3 feet off the ground, glowing faintly in the light. I kept the flashlight trained on them and stepped a little closer to get a better angle. That's when I made out the shape. It was a mountain lion, about 100 yards out, crouched low behind a fallen tree, head slightly raised, staring right at us. It didn't move. It didn't blink, just held still like it was carved out of stone. I could see the outline of its shoulders, the faint shift of its muscles as it breathed. Its body was long and lean, its coat almost blending in with the underbrush. If it hadn't been for the eyes catching the light, I wouldn't have noticed it at all. My stomach dropped. I froze for a second and kept the light steady. Scout hadn't barked yet, but he was still growling, his body angled between me and the animal. I slowly backed up to the fire pit and grabbed the long stick I'd been using to poke at the logs. It was charred black on one end, still warm. I tossed a couple dry branches onto the fire to bring it back up, hoping the flare of light would do something. Maybe scare it off, maybe make it think twice. I didn't want to shout or scream and wake everyone up unless I had to. I kept checking with the flashlight, and the lion was still there, still watching. It hadn't moved an inch. I've seen them before, but never like that. Never so close. Never alone. At night, with my whole family asleep behind me and nothing but a fire between us. My brain kept running through everything I knew. Don't run, make yourself look big, hold your ground. But the truth is, when you see one like that, when it's right there in the dark watching you, none of that advice makes you feel any better. You're not in charge anymore. You're not at the top of the food chain. I stood there for what felt like 10 minutes, just waiting, watching it. Eventually, I saw it turn its head slightly and glance off to the side. Its ears twitched, and then, without making a sound, it vanished into the trees. Just like that. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. I kept the fire going bright for another hour. I didn't sit down, didn't drink anymore. I stood with the flashlight in my hand, turning it toward every sound, every flicker of movement. Scout didn't growl again, but he stayed awake, sitting beside me like he knew something serious had just happened. Around 2:30 a.m., I finally let myself go inside the tent. I zipped it up tight and lay there wide awake for the rest of the night, listening. I didn't hear anything, but I kept replaying the moment in my head. The eyes, the way it moved, how silent it had been. It hadn't been passing through. That thing was watching us. It had probably been there for longer than I realized. The next morning, I didn't say much to the others. Just mentioned that I thought I heard something out in the woods and that we should keep Scout close and the kids near camp. I walked around a bit after breakfast, checking the perimeter of our site. I found prints down near the stream, clear as day. Padded, no claws, definitely feline. Big. It hadn't just wandered in for a peek. It had been circling. We stayed one more night, mostly because I didn't want to scare the kids or cut the trip short over something I could handle. But I never really relaxed after that. I kept the fire bigger, sat with a headlamp around my neck. Scout didn't leave my side, and every 15 minutes or so, I did a slow sweep with the flashlight, scanning the woods beyond the clearing. Nothing ever came back, but the thought never left me. Driving home, I started thinking about all the other times I'd been out in the woods, all the nights I'd sat by the fire, staring into the dark, not seeing a thing. And it made me wonder, how many times had they been there, watching, waiting? How many times had I been sitting out there with a beer in hand and a calm heart, completely unaware that 100 yards away, something was crouched low in the brush, just watching. People always talk about bears when it comes to danger in the woods. But mountain lions, they don't give warnings. They don't snort or huff or rattle branches. They just watch. They wait. And if they decide to make a move, you won't hear it coming. I've camped dozens of times in my life, and I'm not about to stop now. But that night changed the way I see things. I don't assume I'm alone anymore, just because it's quiet. I don't turn my back on the tree line. I don't sit with both earbuds in. And I always make sure the fire's high and the dog's close. Because once you've looked into a pair of eyes glowing out of the woods, and you've realized they've probably been watching you a lot longer than you were watching them, it changes you. You understand, in a very real way, how small you are out there. How easily something could happen if you let your guard down for even a second. I still go out. I still sit by the fire with a cold beer and Scout at my side. But now I keep a flashlight in my lap, and I always check the trees. I started camping late in life. I wasn't raised around it. I didn't grow up pitching tents in the woods or learning how to start fires with flint. I was a city guy working long hours in an office, staring at spreadsheets and blinking monitors. But in my mid-30s, after a rough breakup and a growing need to disconnect from everything, I decided to try getting out into nature. Not the kind of nature you find in parks next to paved jogging trails and dog walkers. I mean real nature. Remote, empty, silent. It was a random Thursday in June when I packed up my old Toyota SUV with a tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler full of food, and a bunch of gear I probably didn't need. I was heading toward the foothills of the Rockies, about 3 hours from where I lived. I'd looked up a few primitive camping spots, places off fire roads and rarely used trails where people were allowed to set up camp. But there were no facilities, no rangers, no other campers. That was exactly what I wanted. Just me, the woods, and whatever was out there. I drove through small towns, past gas stations that looked abandoned, and finally onto a dirt road that twisted up into the hills. After about 40 minutes of rattling over rocks and potholes, I found a wide, flat spot next to a thick patch of pine trees. It looked undisturbed, no tire tracks, no signs of campers. Perfect. I got out, stretched my legs, and felt the quiet immediately. No engines. No talking, just wind moving through trees and the occasional bird call. It was cooler up here, and the air felt clean. I set up my tent about 20 yards from the SUV and laid out a tarp to sit on. I cracked open a beer and watched the sun drop behind the trees. That first night was peaceful. I didn't build a fire because I wasn't in the mood to gather wood, and honestly, I kind of liked the dark. I had a flashlight and a headlamp, but I mostly sat in silence, listening. A couple of times I heard animals in the brush, probably rabbits or raccoons, but nothing too close. I ate a cold sandwich, drank a couple more beers, and eventually crawled into the tent. It was colder than I expected. Even in June, the night air up there bit through my sleeping bag. I pulled the zipper all the way up and used my hoodie as a pillow. I fell asleep to the sound of pine needles rustling outside. I woke up once during the night, not from a sound exactly, but from a feeling. It was probably around 3 or 4 a.m. The kind of dark where you can't see your own hand. I wasn't panicking or anything, but I was wide awake and alert, like my body knew something I didn't. I stayed still, breathing slow, listening. First, all I could hear was wind. Then I heard a single snap. A sharp crack like a stick being stepped on. Came from behind the tent, maybe 20 feet back where the trees were denser. I held my breath. The sound didn't come again. No footsteps, no movement, just that one snap. After a couple of minutes, I told myself it was probably a branch falling or a deer passing through. I eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I shook off the weird feeling. I made some coffee on my camp stove, ate a protein bar, and walked around a bit. The ground behind my tent didn't show anything obvious. No footprints or disturbed ground. But then again, the forest floor here was a mess of pine needles and soft dirt. Tracks wouldn't show unless something heavy left them. That day, I decided to explore. I left the tent and gear as it was and took a small pack with water, a knife, and a couple snacks. I had a good sense of direction, and I made mental notes about landmarks so I could find my way back. I hiked north for a while, moving through thickets and over ridges. I wasn't following a trail. This part of the forest was raw. No signs, no blaze marks, nothing but trees and silence. After a couple of hours, I came across something odd. It was an old camp, not like mine. This one had clearly been there a long time. There was a collapsed tent, bleached and torn like it had gone through several winters. Scattered cans of food, rusted and dented, lay around. A broken folding chair leaned sideways against a tree. The weirdest thing was a small pile of rocks stacked in a perfect tower next to the remains of a fire ring. I didn't touch anything, but I walked around slowly, trying to imagine what had happened here. It didn't feel right. I wasn't scared exactly, but I had this creeping feeling in the back of my head, like I'd walked into someone else's space, a place I wasn't supposed to find. I turned back and headed toward my own camp, keeping a steady pace and checking over my shoulder more than I wanted to admit. I got back in the late afternoon, sweaty and tired. Everything looked the same. Tent untouched, cooler still latched. But something felt off. I didn't realize what it was until after dinner. When I opened my pack and noticed my knife was missing, I was sure I had it when I left that morning. I remembered sliding it into the side pouch. It was a fixed blade in a sheath, pretty large, not the kind of thing you lose by accident. I searched the SUV, the tent, even checked the path I walked in on, but it was gone. I spent the rest of the evening with that same sense of unease. I didn't drink. I didn't build a fire again, which I now regret. As it got darker, I sat in the tent with the flashlight on low and the zipper pulled tight. I didn't sleep much that night. Every small sound made me flinch. Around 2 a.m., I heard something outside. Not a twig snap this time. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Someone or something was circling the tent. I stayed completely still. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. The steps moved behind me, then stopped. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then silence. I waited for what felt like an hour. Eventually, I unzipped the tent a few inches and looked out. My flashlight was in my hand, but I didn't turn it on right away. When I did, I swept the beam in an arc, slowly. Nothing. Just trees and shadows. But about 10 feet from the tent, I saw something on the ground. I got out carefully and walked over. It was my knife, the one I'd lost, lying in the dirt, blade pointing toward the tent. The sheath was missing. The handle looked clean. I picked it up and stood there for a long time. The forest didn't make a sound. That was enough for me. To first light, I packed everything up. I didn't even eat. I threw the tent, cooler, tarp, everything, into the back of the SUV without folding or organizing. I wanted out. I didn't even check the area for more clues. I just drove. The road out seemed longer, rougher, more winding. I kept checking the mirror, expecting to see someone behind me, maybe on foot, watching from the trees. But the forest was empty. When I got home, I left the gear in the SUV. I didn't unpack it for 2 days. I kept thinking about what happened, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I dropped the knife. Maybe an animal dragged it off and somehow brought it back. Maybe the footsteps were a deer. But deep down, I knew better. Someone was out there. Someone saw me arrive. Someone watched me walk into the woods. Maybe they followed me to that abandoned camp. Maybe that wasn't abandoned at all. Maybe I walked right into their territory without realizing it. And the worst part, the part that sticks with me, was the knife. It wasn't just dropped near the tent. It was placed there, pointing at me, like a message. I haven't been camping since. Not really. I've gone on short hikes, day trips, but the overnight stuff, out in the middle of nowhere, no cell signal, no help, no one for miles? No, I'm done with that, because whoever was out there that night wasn't just passing through. They were waiting, watching. Maybe they'd been doing it for years. Maybe they still are. And I was lucky. That's the part one can't shake. I was lucky. I had only been seeing him for a couple of months, and already we were going camping with some of his friends. Not just any camping either, it was in the Chiricahua Mountains in southeastern Arizona. Not a place I'd ever been before. I was still adjusting to the idea of sleeping outside, let alone doing it surrounded by unfamiliar people. On top of that, both of us had just quit smoking cold turkey less than a week earlier. So my nerves were already shot, my body in withdrawal, and now I was getting packed to go sleep in the woods. The drive itself started out quiet. He was excited, chatting about who we were meeting and how beautiful it was up there. I tried to nod and keep a straight face, but I felt like I had swallowed a stone. My chest was tight, my hands sweaty on my thighs. I stared out the passenger window while the desert slowly turned into higher elevation brush and then scattered pines. I didn't want to ruin the trip, but I also didn't want to be there. Eventually, I couldn't keep it together. A few hours into the drive, the tears started. Silent at first, then louder. I couldn't stop them. I tried wiping them on my sleeve, turning away so he wouldn't notice, but he did. I could see him glancing at me from the corner of his eye, looking worried. But I didn't know what to say. I was just overwhelmed. The new relationship, quitting cigarettes, the drive, meeting people I didn't know, going to a remote part of Arizona where there weren't cell towers or towns for miles. It all just piled up. He tried to console me, but I was too deep in my own head. I wanted to turn around, but I didn't want to be the reason we bailed. So I stayed quiet, arms crossed, sniffling as we wound our way up into the mountains. That's when it happened. The road we were on was narrow and not particularly well maintained. It was mostly gravel at that point, with the occasional patch of asphalt thrown in like a half-hearted fix. We came around a bend and then bang, we hit a massive pothole. The car jolted hard, everything inside bouncing. Water bottles, gear bags, my chest against the seatbelt. Then silence. The engine cut out. No sputter, no warning lights, just nothing. He tried the key again, nothing. The lights were still on, so the battery wasn't dead. But the engine wouldn't turn over. We both sat there for a second, just stunned. The sun was halfway down, not quite setting yet, but you could feel that shift in the air, the way it starts to cool fast, the light turning more gold than white. The road was quiet except for the chirping insects and an occasional bird call. Not a great place to get stuck, but at least it wasn't dark yet. He started flipping through the car manual, checking for anything about the engine just shutting off after a hard jolt. I didn't have much to contribute, so I just sat there, chewing my lip, watching for other cars. They did come, here and there, slowing down to ask if we were all right. He kept waving them off. We're good, just figuring it out. But by the third or fourth car, I didn't care about the car anymore. I wanted one thing and one thing only, a cigarette. I had no shame about it. Every time someone pulled over, I leaned over and asked if they had one. No help needed, just a smoke. Every time they said no, I told them they could move along. I hated myself for it, but the craving had overtaken everything else. Even the fear of being stuck out here. Eventually, flipping through the manual again, he found it a safety mechanism. Apparently, after a certain kind of impact, the car automatically shuts down the fuel system as a precaution. I didn't even know cars could do that, but all it took was resetting it through some specific series of steps. Turn the key this way, hold it, open and shut the driver's door, something like that, and after a few minutes, the engine finally kicked back on. We both kind of laughed when it started. It was a short laugh, dry and a little wild, but it felt good to hear it running again. He pulled off the shoulder and we continued up the mountain road, passing that same stupid pothole and taking the turns a little more slowly now. By the time we got to the campsite, I was mentally and physically done. It wasn't even that late, maybe late afternoon, but I felt like I'd been up for a full 24 hours. The sun was low behind the trees and the sky was turning that powdery blue before sunset. There were already a few cars parked in the clearing, and some people were sitting around folding chairs with drinks. He greeted them like old friends. I didn't care. I just wanted a place to lie down. We got the tent up. He did most of the work, hammering in the stakes, unrolling the sleeping bags, stuffing the pillows in. I was barely functional. I pulled off my boots and crawled inside, lying down without even unzipping my jacket. My head hurt. My fingers tingled. I was coming down from a panic, a breakdown, and nicotine withdrawal all at once. Everything was too loud. The wind in the trees, the conversations, the clinking of bottles. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head and closed my eyes. After a few minutes, the sounds outside faded. I must have fallen asleep, because when I opened my eyes again, the light outside the tent had shifted. It was dimmer, that murky twilight that only lasts 20 minutes before full dark. I was alone. I could hear faint voices somewhere off to the side. Probably he had gone on that hike with his friends. The tent was quiet except for the rustling of nylon. But then I heard something else. A slow, deliberate shuffle outside. My heart rate jumped instantly. There was no mistaking it. Something was walking near the tent. I froze. I held my breath and just listened. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate, not the erratic patter of a squirrel or bird. This was something big. I could hear twigs snap under its feet. I didn't move a muscle. Then it paused. I could see it. A shape, just a faint shadow from the light filtering through the tent wall. It was massive, broad, tall. The silhouette loomed. The tent wall moved slightly as something brushed against it. My stomach dropped. The footsteps started again, circling halfway around the tent. I wanted to throw up. My head was buzzing with adrenaline, all thought replaced by instinct. It had to be a bear. We were in bear country. There had been signs posted at the entrance. I remembered reading about black bears in the Chiricahua Mountains, even some grizzlies years ago. My mind ran through everything I'd ever heard about what to do in bear encounters. Don't run, don't make sudden movements, don't provoke it. But I was alone. I had no bear spray, no weapon, nothing. I couldn't stay in the tent. If the bear decided to claw through it, I'd be trapped. My only chance was the car, parked maybe 20 yards away. Not far, but far enough in the dark. Then another horrible realization. I couldn't see. My glasses weren't on. I had left them just outside the tent, near my boots. Everything beyond a few feet was a blur. I debated staying still and waiting it out. But if it was a bear and it smelled food or worse, smelled me, I didn't like my odds. I decided to run. I moved slowly, carefully, unzipping the flap of the tent 1 inch at a time. The zipper sounded like a chainsaw in the silence. I prayed whatever it was wouldn't react. I got the flap open and reached out, feeling around for my glasses. My fingers hit something solid. I grabbed it, my glasses. I slipped them on and blinked, trying to adjust quickly. Then I looked up and froze. Standing in front of me, just 10 feet away, was a huge, shadowy animal. Broad shoulders, wide chest, and a thick tail swaying gently from side to side. My brain screamed bear, but something didn't fit. The tail, it was long and thin, swaying like a rope. Bears don't have tails like that. I squinted harder. My eyes adjusted. It was a cow, a massive dark brown cow. It stood there chewing slowly, staring off to the side like I didn't even exist. My body deflated in an instant. I stood there barefoot, half zipped out of the tent, shaking from the buildup of panic that had nowhere to go now. I felt stupid. I felt relieved. Mostly, I felt drained. Free-range cattle, I remembered reading. They were allowed to roam the area. Probably came in from a nearby ranch. I stepped the rest of the way out of the tent and looked around. There were more, at least 3 others, grazing in the scrub at the edge of the camp. They must have wandered in from the hills. I went to the car anyway, just sat in it for a while, locking the doors even though it didn't really matter. I watched the cows as the last light of day faded and the stars started to show up overhead. One by one, they slowly wandered off. When he got back later with his friends, laughing and flushed from hiking, I was calm. Exhausted, but calm. I told him I was fine and went back to the tent. I didn't mention the cow. Not then. I just lay down, pulled the sleeping bag over me again, and let my body finally settle. The rest of the trip was uneventful. I met his friends, warmed up a little, even managed to laugh. But that moment stayed with me, the panic, the rush, the shadow, the tale. It wasn't a story I told often, but every now and then, when someone talks about how wild Arizona is, I think about that cow in the dark. And I think, yeah, Arizona is weird, man. But sometimes, the things we fear most are just shadows with tails. We'd been talking about going camping for a long time. It was one of those things you always bring up but never actually get around to doing, like fixing a leaky faucet or learning a new skill. My friend Jake and I had known each other since high school. We weren't kids anymore, we were in our late 20s by then, but we both still liked to pretend we had time for stuff like camping. The older we got, the more we understood how fast time was flying, and that made us push ourselves to actually follow through. So one weekend in early fall, we finally made it happen. We didn't want to go to one of those busy, well-known parks. Jake especially hated that. If we're going out there, he told me, we're not going to end up next to a family grilling burgers in a parking lot. So we found a place farther out, something deep and a bit obscure. It was a section of state land in northern Michigan, about a 2-hour drive from where we lived. It wasn't an official campsite, just a patch of forest off a Forest Service road. Jake had read about it on a hunting forum. Someone mentioned it in a thread about quiet places where deer were still abundant. Apparently, nobody went there unless they were tracking something. It was late September when we left. The leaves were just beginning to change, and the mornings had started to carry that dry, earthy chill. I packed light but deliberate freeze-dried meals, water filter, first aid kit, layers of clothes, my old pack. Jake was more into gear than me. He had a much newer tent, a better knife, even some sort of solar-powered battery pack for emergencies. We were both used to being outdoors, but he was always more intense about it. We got there in the late afternoon. The road had turned into rough gravel a few miles back, and then it faded into something you wouldn't even call a road anymore. More like a set of tire tracks that wove between trees. We had to park when the trees got too tight and finish the rest on foot. We hiked for maybe 25 minutes before finding a spot we both liked. A flat patch of dirt in a small clearing surrounded by dense pines and some hardwoods. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. There were no old fire rings, no trash, no signs. It was perfect. We set up camp in a kind of routine way. We both had our own tents and set them up on opposite sides of the clearing, maybe 30 feet apart. Jake got a small fire going while I unpacked our food. The air was cold enough that we could see our breath once the sun dipped behind the trees. It got quiet fast, too. There were birds chirping earlier, the usual wind in the leaves sound. But that all seemed to hush as dusk settled. We didn't really think about it. In fact, we were enjoying the stillness. That first night was uneventful. We ate, sat by the fire for a while, then went to bed. The ground was a little uneven, and I remember shifting around a lot, trying to get comfortable. I fell asleep sometime after midnight, and I remember waking up once to pee, stepping out into the pitch black and listening to what I thought was an animal moving far off. But it didn't bother me. I'd been out in the woods enough to know how much sound traveled at night. The next morning started like any other. Jake had gotten up before me and had coffee going. We talked about going farther into the woods that day just to explore, maybe follow the creek we'd heard running the night before. We spent most of that morning walking. The trees here were thick, and it was clear the land hadn't been logged in a long time. Everything was overgrown and quiet. It was beautiful, but it also felt, dense, oppressive maybe, like the trees were almost leaning in on you in certain places. We didn't bring much with us on the hike, just water, a snack, a compass, and a whistle each. I remember Jake kept stopping to mark trees with a piece of red tape he brought. I asked him why, and he shrugged. Just being safe, he said. That was another thing about him. He always acted casual about being prepared, but you could tell he thought about every angle. By late afternoon, we were back at camp. That's when the feeling started. It wasn't anything huge at first, just a kind of off sense. The way you feel when you walk into a room and forget why. I brushed it off as fatigue. Jake didn't say anything either, but he seemed a little more restless than usual. He walked around the perimeter of the clearing a few times, quietly looking out into the trees. I asked him what he was doing, and he said he thought he'd seen something moving earlier. Probably a deer, maybe a bear. It wasn't out of the question, so we just kept the fire going and made sure to clean up our food properly. I still didn't feel right, though. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The forest was dead silent. No wind, no insects. It was like something had shut it off. I lay there listening to my heartbeat, staring at the inside of my tent and feeling the hairs on my arms standing up. At some point, I thought I heard heavy footsteps, just 2 or 3. I held my breath and listened. Then nothing. Total silence again. I waited maybe half an hour, just straining, ears open. Eventually, I passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, Jake looked tired too. He didn't bring up the night, and neither did I. We both avoided the subject, like maybe if we didn't talk about it, it wouldn't matter. We went on a shorter hike that day, mostly just around the edges of our camp. We saw some tracks, deer maybe, or something else. They were too vague to identify. They didn't look fresh, but it put us both on edge. Around late afternoon, Jake said he was going to check something out and left on his own. heading off toward a thicker part of the woods. I stayed behind to boil water and clean up a bit. An hour passed, then two. I started to worry, but I told myself not to overreact. It was Jake, he was always cautious. Then 3 hours passed, and the sun was going down. I blew the whistle, waited, blew it again. Nothing. By the time it got dark, I was pacing. I didn't want to go looking in the dark. I'd just get lost or injured, but I couldn't just sit there either. I built the fire up high, grabbed a flashlight and my knife, and walked the direction I'd seen him go. I only went a few 100 feet in. The trees were too thick and the light too poor. It didn't feel safe. I turned back. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going all night, staring into the dark and listening for anything. At one point, I thought I heard a branch snap far off. Then I thought I saw something move, but it was just a shadow. I felt totally alone and helpless. The next morning, I packed what I could and left a note at the campsite. I marked it with stones and put Jake's extra gear under a tarp. I hiked out fast, back to the car. My legs were shaking, not just from fear but from sheer stress and physical strain. Once I had signal, I called the county sheriff. They told me to wait at the trailhead and a deputy would meet me. What followed was the worst 3 days of my life. A search team went in that afternoon. Dogs, drones, people calling out his name, checking under brush, over ridges, everything. Nothing. Not a single thing. Not even his tape marks. I kept asking myself, did I miss something? Did he leave some kind of sign I didn't see? Could I have followed him sooner? Should I have tried to find him that night? On the third day, they found his body. It wasn't far from the campsite, maybe half a mile, in a gully filled with fallen logs. He'd apparently slipped on some moss and fallen hard, hitting his head on a sharp edge of stone. The coroner said it was instant or close to it. They were confident it was an accident. No foul play, no animals, just bad luck. Just a freak accident in the middle of nowhere. I wanted to scream when I heard that. All that time I'd spent terrified, thinking something was out there, thinking something was watching us, thinking I'd failed him. He was already gone. Hours before I even noticed he was missing. I never went back out to that campsite. Couldn't. Jake's family didn't ask for many details, which I was grateful for. I told them the truth, but I kept it simple. The truth was already bad enough. After the funeral, I couldn't stop going back over every detail. The silence, the feeling, the unease. I tried to reason it away, but something in my gut had known something was off. Maybe it was just instinct. Maybe it was useless fear, but it had been real to me. Since then, I haven't been able to enjoy the woods the way I used to. I still hike, but I don't camp alone. I don't go deep, and I never, ever ignore that feeling in my gut anymore. Jake died because of a single misstep. Nothing hunted us. No evil spirit. No murderer. Just nature. Just an accident. But that's what makes it worse. There's no one to blame. No one to fight. No way to stop it from happening again. Just a friend, a forest, and a moment that changed everything. I was around 8 or 9 years old when this happened, but the details have stuck with me clearly ever since. It was one of those memories that doesn't fade over time, no matter how much you wish it would. We used to go camping a lot when I was younger. It was always the same campground, about a 2-hour drive from the small town we lived in. Over the years, it became a kind of tradition. My mom, grandma, my 2 younger brothers, and me, we went so often that we had kind of built up our own little spot there. Not a cabin or anything like that, just a well-worn campsite that felt like it belonged to us. A good place under the trees with some cleared-out ground for the tents and a fire pit we'd built up over the years with smooth rocks from the nearby stream. On this particular trip, we had 2 dogs with us, Star and Ariel. They weren't our dogs. They belonged to my aunt and uncle, who were both away on military tours at the time. We were just watching the dogs while they were gone. Star was a black and white German short-haired pointer, and Ariel was a slightly older golden retriever. Both were trained for bird hunting, but even with their instincts, they were the calmest and most obedient dogs I'd ever seen. You could set food in front of them and they wouldn't touch it unless you gave them the go-ahead. They didn't bark much, tent barely made a sound unless it was important. That's what made the whole thing feel so strange. We'd gotten to the campsite that afternoon. I remember it was warm out, one of those early summer days where the sun stays up a bit longer, and the air cools just enough in the evening to make sleeping in a tent manageable. We did all the usual things that first day. Got the tent set up, gathered firewood, went down to the creek to splash around and skip stones. Mom made hot dogs over the fire and passed out sodas while Grandma sat in her lawn chair watching the fire crackle. The dogs lounged in the dirt nearby, occasionally sniffing around but mostly just laying there and dozing. We all went to bed around 10 or so. I remember feeling completely safe. It was that type of tired you get when you've been outside all day, heavy and slow, but in a good way. The tent smelled like pine needles and dust, and the soft sound of the woods around us just made everything feel calm. The dogs slept inside the big tent with us. That was part of the deal Mom had made since they weren't our dogs. She wanted to make sure nothing happened to them, so they stayed close. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, but it was definitely still pitch dark outside. The tent was quiet, and for a few seconds I thought I might have just had a bad dream. But then I heard this low, steady growl. It wasn't loud, but it was constant, like something barely holding back. I froze and turned my head toward the sound. Star was awake and crouched in front of the tent's zippered door. Her shoulders were tense, head low, teeth bared slightly. Her ears were up, and she wasn't moving, just growling softly at something outside. Ariel was awake too. She wasn't growling, but she had that same tense posture. Her body was turned toward the back corner of the tent, where the opening flaps were tied shut. She was listening. That was almost worse than the growling. Seeing them both act like something was out there, something worth worrying about. I felt this cold rush go through my body, not from the air, but from something else. My heart started beating faster, and I pulled my sleeping bag up around my shoulders without even thinking. I didn't move otherwise. I didn't want to make any sound. I didn't even want to breathe loudly. The others started waking up too, one by one. My mom sat up and looked at the dogs. Her whole body went tense the moment she saw them. The tent was still zipped closed, but the way Star was acting made it feel like there was something just a few feet away watching us. She kept glancing back at my mom, then at the tent door, and then growling again. Ariel was standing by then, ears back and body lowered like she was waiting for something to happen. Neither of them barked, just tense, quiet growling and stillness. My mom didn't say anything out loud, but she slowly reached for the flashlight next to her bag, checked to make sure it was working, then unzipped the tent just enough to slide out. Star and Ariel pushed forward with her, blocking her from moving too far. That's when it got even stranger. Usually, if you open the tent and step out, the dogs would follow right at your heels. But this time, they wouldn't let her go anywhere near the edge of the campsite. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, so the area was still dimly lit. I remember watching through the mesh of the tent window. Star and Ariel kept positioning themselves in front of my mom, literally moving to block her path anytime she tried to step further out. They weren't acting like normal dogs. They were doing something intentional. It was like they were protecting us. But from what? At one point, Star lunged low toward the dark edge of the trees, growling so fiercely her whole body shook. Her fur bristled. Ariel joined in, both of them with tails stiff and bodies rigid. Then they both turned around and started nudging my mom toward the car, hurting her. She resisted at first but gave in fast, backing up toward the car and unlocking it. They kept themselves between her and the woods the entire time. That's when I really started to panic. My brothers were crying, both trying to stay quiet but totally losing it. Grandma had gone pale and was packing up bags in this frantic, shaky way. My mom came back to the tent and told us all to grab our shoes and get in the car. No hesitation, no second guessing. We left the tents behind. She just grabbed her keys and her purse and shoved us into the back seat. We didn't even get the cooler. No blankets. Just threw ourselves in the car and started backing out. I didn't know what was happening, but something about the way the dogs acted made it clear we were not supposed to be there anymore. The second we got the car started, the dogs jumped in the back with us, still growling. Low and steady. It didn't stop. We pulled out of the campsite and started down the gravel road that led back to the highway. It was about a 15-minute drive to reach the main road from where we'd been. No streetlights, no houses, just trees on either side. The road curved and dipped in places and was narrow enough that only one car could really fit at a time. We'd done that drive dozens of times before, but this time it felt completely different. Maybe 5 minutes in, a pair of headlights appeared behind us. At first, I figured it was just another camper heading out. Maybe someone who got spooked too or just packed up early. But they didn't keep a normal distance. They followed close, too close. They rode our bumper around every curve. Even on the steep parts where most people slow down, they stayed right on us. The dogs stood with their paws up on the back seat, heads turned toward the rear window, still growling. Not barking, just that low, rumbling sound that made my chest hurt. My mom sped up a little, but the road was too narrow and winding to go fast. She didn't say anything. I remember how tightly she gripped the steering wheel. I was watching her hands shake while the trees blurred past the windows. We kept thinking the car would pass us once we reached the main road. But it didn't. It stayed behind us. Even when we turned, it turned. When we slowed down, it slowed down. It didn't matter what we did. They stayed with us. I kept trying to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. I even made up some fake explanation in my head. Like maybe they were scared too and just wanted to stick close. But deep down, I knew that wasn't what was happening. We kept driving like that for almost 2 hours, all the way back toward town. Every now and then, the car behind us would fall back a little, then speed up again and close the gap. We didn't stop once. No bathroom breaks. No slowing down. The road back into our town crossed a long, elevated bridge that stretched over a river valley. Once you crossed it, there was no quick way to turn around. As we approached it, the car was still behind us. My mom didn't hesitate. She just kept driving, faster than before. Then, halfway across the bridge, I looked back and saw the headlights behind us stop. The car didn't follow us across. It just sat there. Then it turned around and sped back the way we came. We made it into town and stopped at a gas station. Everyone was on edge. My brothers were still crying quietly, and Grandma looked sick. The dogs were finally quiet, but they were sitting stiff, eyes watching every movement outside the car. My mom got out and went inside to buy cigarettes and a soda. When she came back and tried to get in the car, Star blocked the door. Wouldn't let her in until she stood under the light where the dog could see her face clearly. Even now, that's the part one think about the most. That camping trip changed everything for me. We never went back to that site. We never even talked about it much afterward. I think my mom was just trying to pretend it didn't happen. Or maybe she really didn't understand what happened either. The tents and the rest of the gear were left behind. We never replaced them. I haven't been camping since. Not once. I don't think I ever will. Because something happened out there. Something the dogs knew and we didn't. And whatever it wasn't normal. It wasn't a bear or a raccoon or some kid playing a prank. It was something or someone that didn't want us there. And I think if the dogs hadn't been with us that night, we might not have made it home.